Scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Ruth, one of two books in the Bible named for women. And this is Ruth's story on the pages of this biblical book. We are going to read the middle part of her story, which many of us are familiar with, her whole story. But we'll begin our reading this morning with the first 18 verses of chapter 2. Ruth meets Boaz in the grain field. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained there from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it into the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. This is God's holy word for us this morning. Naomi and Ruth's story is one that captures our attention. It's a story of family, commitment, sacrifices, and love. It is a story that stirs up our emotions as we walk with Naomi, as she leaves Moab following her husband and both sons' deaths to return to her homeland of Bethlehem. We also experience the generosity and the sacrifice when Ruth, whose husband, Naomi's son, is now gone, decides to travel with Naomi and leave her homeland of Moab to completely rebuild her life in Bethlehem. Not to mention in a new town where she will be a foreigner and even considered an outcast by many. But her options are limited, and her love and care for her mother-in-law make the decision for her. Even when Naomi tells her not to come with, declaring that life will be challenging even more so in Bethlehem. Ruth is adamant, however, and states, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." Ruth is willing to sacrifice almost everything by leaving Moab. In Bethlehem, she will be stripped of any status, a grieving widow, a stranger in a foreign land. She will be a woman accepting and believing in a new God, Naomi's God of Israel. Ruth is willing to trust in her new God's promised land, know the joy of God's people, and learn that God's harvest is for all. When Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, it was time for the harvest. They gathered for warmth and a shelter on a small plot of land owned by Naomi's family. Shelter, but probably not much else. An old plot overgrown with thorns. No time to plant a crop before harvest, even if there was money for seed. Unless there was another way to get food, they would starve. But Naomi knew the law of Moses and urged Ruth to follow the harvesters and glean or gather the stalks they left behind. The law of Moses instructed landowners to leave what the harvesters missed so that the poor, the foreigner, the widow, and the fatherless could glean for their needs. Ruth fell into almost all of these categories, as did her mother-in-law. The harvesters were not to reap to the very edges of their fields, nor were they to go over the field a second time to pick up what they missed the first time. This grain was to be left for those who had need. This Israelite welfare system set up by Moses took care of the needy by encouraging the richer landowners to share their bounty with those less fortunate. But it wasn't a handout. They still had to work for their food, following along behind the harvesters in the hot sun, picking up what was left by them, and that took time and energy. Depending on the efficiency of the field hands and the number of other gleaners reaping the grain, it could be difficult to do more than just survive. Ruth decides that she can do that. She can gather up what the reapers left behind. She will do that. She is young. She can work. But will it be safe? There is no choice. No harvesting, no gleaning, no food. Word had gotten out around town. People were talking about Boaz's relative Naomi and her unexpected return. Ruth, her daughter-in-law, they said, had come with. They had the shared tragedy of losing their husbands. They also admired the extraordinary loyalty the younger had shown toward the older mother-in-law, even promising to renounce her Moab idols for Israel's God. Ruth worked hard, quickly and efficiently, stuffing grain into the sack slung across her shoulder. She rested, but only for a moment, her eyes always on the lookout for any sign of trouble. Gleaning was tough work. and dangerous, especially for a young foreigner alone and unprotected. The workers swung their sickles in even rhythms through the standing grain. Ruth followed at a distance. The field where they worked belonged to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, Ruth's father-in-law, Naomi's deceased husband. The barley looks good this year, ready for harvest. I've got large fields, so I've hired in men to help out. The sun is up, the grain is ripe. A good choice for a harvest day. After surveying his fields and greeting his workers, Boaz inquires about the young woman gleaning in his field. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She has to glean and gather the sheaves left behind the harvesters. She's got some guts, that one, doing her duty by Naomi, coming right into the lion's den. No way back to her people in Moab now. Not much welcome for foreigners around here. Memories are held fast. Ruth was taking a risk by being in the fields, yet Boaz extends a helping hand by personally inviting her to follow along the women of his field that were collecting and binding the grain into sheaves to later be threshed. Ruth would be able to then glean what lay on the ground and thresh it by hand by beating it with a stick for grain to provide for herself and Naomi. Determined to repay Ruth's kindness to Naomi in some way, Boaz called to her, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. When you are thirsty, go and have a drink from the water jars over there." Boaz had warned the harvesters, told them to let her work with the women in safety. Boaz had heard her story and shared a blessing, calling on his God, Ruth's God now too. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth replied that she was grateful for having found favor in his eyes, that she was now at ease to gather in his field as one without even the status of servant. At mealtime, Ruth was invited to share the bread, dipping it in the wine vinegar, and eat some of the roasted grain. When she had finished eating, she set aside her leftovers to save for Naomi. Boaz, meanwhile, instructed his men to pull out some stalks of grain and strew them in her path. It was good to see her leaving that night with a bulging sack filled with the day's harvest. The day was long. Naomi worried. But Ruth came home with over half a bushel basket of barley, enough to keep them from going hungry for several weeks, maybe. The leftovers from her lunch that she shared were wonderful too, like bread from heaven. Ruth found hope as she was allowed to glean, and as she is protected in providing food for herself and Naomi in a time of want and need. This middle part of Ruth and Naomi's story is one of hope. Hope in the midst of the harvest in Boaz's barley field. Ruth finding the fields of Boaz and being looked after in his fields among the gleaners awakens hope in Naomi's heart. But that hope would need to be harvested too. There needed to be a longer, greater solution for Naomi and Ruth's care after the harvest season was over. Something else happened in the harvest fields that day. Just for a moment, Ruth didn't feel like a foreigner, an outsider in Bethlehem. Day after day, Boaz watched her, aware that the wheat and barley harvests were almost over. What would happen then? What would Naomi and Ruth do? How would they be provided for? Naomi had an idea. Boaz had a possible solution. God had a definite plan. Boaz knew there was an obstacle that could get in the way of him stepping in to serve as guardian and redeemer, as a relative of Naomi's. There was a closer relative who could serve in the role of guardianship. This man was entitled to purchase the field belonging to Naomi, but according to the law, to purchase the field, he had to marry Ruth as well, restoring her dead husband's name. Boaz wasted no time laying out the situation before the other man, who seemed interested enough in the land. But as soon as he discovered that marriage was part of the bargain, he let go of his rights to the land, giving all rights to Boaz. The kindness shown by Boaz to Ruth is a significant sign of hope as he steps in to serve as guardian and redeemer. He was acting upon God's law, honoring Naomi's rights as a relative. She claimed her rights to protection under God's law. He had given her charity before, leaving extra grain in the safety of his fields. But now, Naomi asked for justice. Boaz did his duty and more. He shared justice and delivered it with joy and wedded it with kindness, taking Ruth as his wife. Was it by chance that Ruth found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech? Of course not. Even in what appeared to be a chance encounter in the harvest field, God was at work, divinely preparing for Ruth and Naomi's survival. Never assume that what happens in your life is merely a matter of chance or coincidence. Remember, God is at work, divinely harvesting events to bring about God's harvest or purposes in your life. God's harvest was right there in the lives of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, giving them all hope for what was to come. Hope of God's harvest. There was also restoration. Restoration first comes as Naomi returns from Moab to the promised land and to Bethlehem, which means house of bread. Then, as Ruth insists on traveling with her, restoration continues with the harvest season, when the fullness of the land is gathered in, and in the kindness of a distant relative and man of status. For Naomi, the harvest brought reconciliation with her people, in her hometown, and her distant family. For Ruth, it was finding a new home and being accepted and loved, no longer a stranger and foreigner. Transformation is there too. Transformation from despair to happiness for all three of them. God's harvest of hope in this story is found also in the restoration, the transformation, and the blessing. God's blessing covers Ruth and Naomi as the women move from emptiness to fullness, from destitution to security and hope. For Boaz, the harvest was in God bringing him a new family, happiness, and a wife in Ruth to share life and love with. God's harvest for all of them was the blessing and birth of Obed, blessed son and grandson. From the gleaning of love and faithfulness of her daughter-in-law, who was better to her than 7 sons, Naomi was now blessed with a grandson to love and cherish. God's harvest brought Ruth welcome and acceptance, love and care, hope and a new home, and now a new family. The new to her God she trusted in was there to help her find her way. For all of them, God's harvest was filled with sustenance, bounty, and an abundance of hope, love, and care. But even then, they did not realize how greatly God had blessed them or what the real harvest of hope would be. But we do. Ruth and Boaz would parent Obed, who became the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. In addition to being King David's great-grandparents, both Boaz and Ruth are part of the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth. God's harvest of hope would ultimately be in the birth of Jesus as our own guardian redeemer, giving us the hope of all things to come. Ruth had no way of knowing that her harvest of hope, her own sacrifice and blessing that she shared with Naomi, would eventually become a blessing in her own life. That's just the divine work of our God, who delights so much in seeing us love and bless others, that God then turns into love and blessing back upon us in double measure. The harvest is ready, and God does indeed provide. The blessing and love almost fill a bushel basket. Hope in God's harvest can absolutely do that. May it always be so. Amen.